meet my big brother. Now you might be thinking, what's Peter doing? This is the most popular passage, the most popular parable. We've heard lots of sermons on this. Peter himself has actually spoken on it. But humor me, I want to come at it in a different way. Some rightly say that this isn't a story about the prodigal son, it's about the older brother. And that would be true because Jesus knew his audience. His audience was the Pharisees. His audience was people that were of the Jewish faith that knew that there were certain things you had to do. You did each one of these, and if you did them, that was all that God required. But he was saying, no, God loves you. And there was something else. He was saying that the elder brother was the Pharisees. And he was never easy on the Pharisees. There's other parables that Jesus told that particularly put the Pharisees in a bad light. There were ones that he told that they wanted to kill him because they could see themselves in the mirror. As I was reading, I read the story. It's about a prince who left his father and did something wrong, and he didn't want to come back, and his friend said, you need to return. So here's the story. A king had a son who had gone astray from his father on a journey of 100 days. His friend said to him, return to your father. He said, I cannot. Then his father sent word, return as far as you can, and I'll come the rest of the way to you. It's a beautiful song. The story is that the father wanted so bad to have his son, he would go get him. He wanted to make sure that he knew that there was no reason that he could not return. Now, this is the story that Pastor Vernon McGee told. He said there was this pastor of a large church in the last century, and he was happy with where he was, but he never spoke. He was a very liberal pastor, never spoke to his congregation about salvation and sin. Those topics were never brought up. And he was happy. He had a rich congregation. He was paid well. He was happy, and his congregation was happy. And then something happened to him. A little boy, poor, came to him with an urgent request. The little boy said, I need you to come and help my grandmother cross. Well, what is your grandmother crossing? Why do I need to come? Why can't she? And the little boy thought that the pastor, for a pastor and very smart, was quite dense. And so he had to explain to him that his grandmother was passing, she was going to die. And not only was she going to die, she was scared of dying because she knew she had sinned, but she didn't know about God, and she had to have a pastor come and explain it to her, which presented a problem to him, actually more than one problem. First problem was he never explained this to anyone before in his life. He never spoke to his congregation about sin and the sacrifice of Jesus, but he also was a very proud man. And he said, this is an easy task. This is something that a pastor should have to do all the time to be able to help somebody who is dying. And so his pride wouldn't let him not go, but he was scared to go because he had nothing to say. And he was thinking those thoughts when he came upon a memory from the past, John 3:16. John 3:16 has something. So he arrived with the little boy, and he read John 3:16 to the woman. He sat down beside her, and she was very sick, but her mind was bright, and he opened his Bible to John 3:16. And he said, for God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him shall not perish, but have everlasting life. And she said, well, is that true? Is that true? And he said, well, it says it here. we should believe it. It's the Bible. Now, he didn't believe it, but he said, and then he read on to verse 17, for God did not send his Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. He who believes in him is not judged, but he who does not believe in him has been judged already, because he did not believe in the name of the only begotten Son of God. So the woman is saying, is that true? Do all I have to do is believe on Jesus? And is that it? And he said, yes, that's what it seems to say. And so she was extremely happy, and in spite of his awkwardness and not being able to help her, she asked Jesus to come to save her. He said, Jesus, I don't know how to do this, but I know I need to, and I believe you that you are the Son of God and you are the only way to heaven. And so she was wonderfully saved, and she was awful grateful for him coming, and she thanked him, and he went home. And as he told this story later on, and he said, and there was a poor pastor that was saved that day too. And he was awfully grateful that the little boy had come to him and asked him to do it. I thought that was a really nice story that explained that see, his problem was he was preaching from the Bible, but he was creating a whole church full of elder brothers. Brothers who could say to anybody who asked, we have given God the full measure of whatever he needed, and they were content in their own righteousness. They had enough righteousness to hold their head up high and put them in a perfect position to look down on those other people, those people that were weaker and lesser, that struggled with sin. Now, in the story, it wasn't so much that the brother wanted a party. He was resentful that the father had given a party to this son that didn't deserve it. I work with a guy, and he's not a Christian. He will freely admit that he has no interest in being Christian, but he has a list of people that he does not want God to let into heaven. And he's very vocal on those. And the problem with that is the elder brother was saying, no, he does not deserve this mercy that you're giving him. What he's done has cost him all of that. Now, it's easy for us to become that elder brother. We can forget about that we too need the message of the gospel, the message of salvation. To remember that we're on the side of the weak and the poor and the naked and the alone, with nothing to bring in exchange for salvation. See, it's easy to think that we're not the person that needs this message of salvation. It's for other people. There was I'm trying to remember the guy's name and I can't come up with it, but he writes books, and he had a talk, and he said, weddings are not for the man and the woman saying the vows. It's not for them at all. It's for the people sitting in the audience. It's to remind them again of why they love the person they're married to, why it's so important that they stay married and stay faithful. And if you get invited to a wedding and you are married and you hear this and you say, yes, that's true, I have to thank that person who spent $10,000 to have a wedding just to remind me how grateful I should be for my spouse. Well, it's really nice to be reminded how grateful we are that Jesus died on the cross to save us. Not for someone who is lesser than us, not for someone who struggles with sin more than us, but for us. We need to include the message of the gospel often so that we keep the joy of the younger brother. who would have been exceptionally joyful. You know that the father ran to the son, but the son wouldn't run to the father because he knew he had no right to have this joy. But now they were having a party for him because I thought to myself that the staff, the hired hands, the servants, the slaves would all have a day off. And if somebody is really happy, it's contagious. You can't not be happy with them. Unless, of course, you're the elder brother. He was probably someone that, if you remember the story about the people who came to Jesus with the woman caught in adultery, and he could have cast the first stone. He was that good. I'm making that up, by the way. He probably wasn't. Now, but let me start. This is the first point. The "I told you so" brother, the one we love to hate. Now, I'm going to read this passage again. I'm being watchful of the time. And he said, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to the father, I'm going to read to 17. Give me the share of the estate that falls to me. So he divided his wealth between them. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in the country, and he began to be impoverished. So he went and hired himself out to one of the citizens of the country, and he sent him into the field to feed swine. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, but no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, how many of my father's hired hands have more than enough bread, and I've died here of hunger? Well, there's a movie that I always liked, My Fair Lady, 1962, My Fair Lady. And it's Eliza Doolittle is selling flowers in the square. And this guy comes and he is with his friend and he says, I could teach her to speak well and be able to get a job in a flower shop. And so she eventually comes to his house with a little bit of money that she's gathered from selling flowers, and she said, I want to teach you. I want you to teach me how to speak so I can get a job in a flower shop. And he has a bet with his friend, and you know this, if you've watched the movie, you know the story. She comes to stay with him, and she gets all wonderful new clothes, and she learns, and she gets a bath, and the father comes, and that's the guy in the story that we're talking about. The father comes, and he says, I see you picked up my daughter, and he winks, and he knows what's going on, except he doesn't. And he says, I think I should get something, and I want 10 pounds. And the guy says, I'll give you 30 pounds. No, 10 pounds is enough, because if you give me 30, it's too much, and I won't be able to spend it without feeling guilty. And then he said something that's I thought was, I've never forgotten. He said, the one, let me get this right so I don't, he said, the undeserving poor need more charity than the deserving poor, because we just blow it up, we just it goes through our fingers like water. He was the undeserving poor. This guy, this young man in the story that we just read, he was that guy. He's the undeserving poor. He doesn't deserve anything. He has no right to ask. It screams. The story screams, I told you so. It screams to you to bring out your righteous indignation and say, this guy doesn't deserve anything. Now you notice that if you get to verse 30, it says, who devoured, the older brother says, who devoured your wealth with prostitutes. He figured it out. no one told him. He just walked in and he asked the servant what's going on. He didn't even know his brother had come back, but immediately he figured it out because he knew who he was. He knew that as soon as the safety net had been removed, his brother would be a horrible mess. He'd turn his life upside down. Now, this is Jesus' story. This is Jesus' parable. So he was creating the characters. He created the younger brother, the older brother, and the father. And he made them perfect. He made a character as in the younger son that older brother types, like the Pharisees, would hate immediately. They would not have any question. There's no gray area here. No big dreams of a son going off to do something and it all failed, and even in spite of the fact he tried. Now, I'll give you a story yesterday that happened to me. I forgot to take an allergy pill. It's about this big every morning, and I forgot yesterday. Last night I couldn't sleep at all because I couldn't breathe. At 4 o'clock I got up and took the allergy pill, and by 6 I could breathe again. But the point was, no one's going to say, Peter, you're a horrible person. No, they're going to say you forgot you were. And see, Jesus didn't leave any space in the story for someone to say, this son, no. He was drawn. It's a picture of a person who's like a moth drawn to the fire. If you were standing in the crowd listening to this, you would say, even if you were a person who gave people a second chance, who said, well, I'd like to give him if he tried and failed, this wouldn't be the guy you gave a second chance to. He failed on purpose. Who wants to give this guy a second chance? He made his bed. He should have to lie in it. Now, if you look on the surface of it, you think, well, maybe the father said, my son is getting this money. He's going to go off and make a life for himself. He's going to go make his fortune. But if you look deeper into it, you'll see something else. Jesus told the story of a father who loved his son and was willing to play the long game. He gave him money knowing that it was all going to be wasted. If the older brother could figure out what was happening, the father could too. He was older and wiser, and he would know that this is what was going to happen. And he was willing to forfeit a third of his hard-earned money to have the son go off and blow it on prostitutes with the hope, the desire that he would return a man who had learned a lesson, who was willing to recognize what sin would cause. Well, this story was to illustrate the goodness of God, and sometimes that goodness involves removing the thing that keeps us from a loving God. In this case, he spent everything and the famine followed. And I noticed this as I read this. There's all sorts of bad things you can say about the younger son. He was selfish. He wanted his inheritance before his father died, which is not the way it works. He gathered it together and he spent it on riotous living. He didn't care about the future or anything. And all those bad things are true. But there's one thing you can say about him. He was brought up well. It said that he wanted the pods. In verse 16 it says he wanted the pods to fill his stomach. The swine were eating, but no one was giving anything to him. He knew, he could see that even though, now, pigs are fed all sorts of bad stuff. It's not like the cats get this really fancy food. No, dog. Pigs are fed potato peelings and carrot peelings, and nobody counts that stuff. So he could have taken anything he wanted and had his fill, and no one would ever know. But he didn't see it as his own. He saw it would be stealing. Now, standing there with those pods, looking at them, and his stomach was growling, he realized that his father's servants had all they could eat, and I get this picture of servants who knew that the fridge was there for them and they could go and get something out of it if they needed it, if they were hungry. Now, of course, they didn't have a fridge, but you get the general idea. I'll tell you a story about somebody who appreciated the kindness of an employer. The first job I had was at Stonehurst Farm, and we were picking strawberries for him to sell. And they gave us each a flat, which is 12 boxes of quarts, 12 quarts of berries. I'm dropping you off here, you pick right there. That's your 3 rows, you fill these 12, I'll be back. And there were 6 of us. So off we went with our flat, and we're picking. He said, look, if you want to eat strawberries, you're entitled to eat strawberries. I'm not going to tell you not to. And everybody thought, well, that's really nice. And they maybe had 2 dozen strawberries, and then they continued to pick. And they were grateful. We were all done. All 5 of us were done. 12 quarts of berries in a box waiting for the guy to come back. And there was one boy who had only 6 quarts. And we couldn't figure out why. Why didn't he have... Well, we all got together and helped him, and we filled his bins up, and they came back, and he didn't show up the next day. We knew why. He'd eaten 6 quarts of strawberries. You see, the point is that the servants would appreciate it. He would know the story of the servants, how the father had always been kind. And some people take advantage. This little boy did. And he paid the price too. But his son knew that they had enough food. And so we've met now the hard-to-love character in the story. And let's move on to the next character. Number 2 is the father who loved his son only a father could love. Verse 18 to 24. I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me one of the hired men. So he got up and came to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him and felt compassion for him and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And the son said to him, Father, I've sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I'm no longer worthy to be called your son. But the father said to his slaves, Quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet, and bring the fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine who was dead has now come to life again, who was lost has been found. And they began to celebrate. Now, there's 2 ways you can see that. Now, Jesus, as he told that story, knew the Pharisees would see that as in one way. And the people who had lived a life of being told there was no salvation for them because they weren't good enough would cry. It was such a beautiful story. This father had every right to tell his son that he had no business coming back. And he had every right to tell him that he had no business asking for his inheritance until he had died. You don't get this like the cart before the horse. And the listeners to the story would hear this, the fact that the father gave his son the money and say, that's the wrong thing to do. You're setting a bad precedent. Other fathers will do the same thing. Or other sons will demand the same thing. As I said earlier, the father was playing a long game. He was allowing his son a third of all the money he had to go off to learn that this isn't, I'm going to still love you when you come back. As I said, I expected the hired hands and the servants loved this father, and they knew that he was watching, and they asked why he was watching, and so they were keeping a watch for the son too. But as you notice in the story, the father saw him first. The father had the sharper eyes. The father cared the most. Now, if you notice, there was no requirement more than him coming back. He didn't have to do anything else. He just had to recognize in humility that I must return. You know that when a man and a woman are married and one of them has an affair and the other spouse is willing to give them forgiveness, they may be forgiven, but they have to earn back the trust that they have broken. This isn't the way it was with the father. He didn't say you must work, and if you prove yourself, I will love you. No, he loved him immediately. It's a picture of God, how much he loves us. You see, he was rejoicing at his return. In spite of the fact that he was empty-handed and starving, whatever, the father was just overjoyed. Number 3 is the son who demanded the love he had earned. Verse 25 says, and the older son was in the field, and when he approached the house, he heard music and dancing, and he summoned one of the servants. He began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he's received him back safe and sound. But he became angry, and he was not willing to go in, and his father came out and began pleading with him. And he answered and said to his father, look, for so many years I've been serving you and have never neglected a command of yours, and yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours came, who had devoured your wealth with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, son, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we have to celebrate and rejoice, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, was lost and has been found. Do you remember what I said about the honesty of the father had rubbed off on his son? He'd been brought up well. Well, the question I have is, did his father's forgiveness rub off on the older son? The answer I'd have to say is no, it didn't. I think if the elder son had been the one to make the decision, he might let his younger brother return, but he would have gotten the hired hand, the worst job every day, and been reminded every day of how this mercy I'm giving you, you don't deserve. Not only was he angry, he was also jealous of the gift that his father was giving the other son. I've heard this expression before of sons and daughters who are watching their parents do something. And they're saying, you're spending my inheritance. Well, that's not the right way to look at it. Not at all. You see, he may be thinking, because the father said, all of that I have is yours. So the elder son is basically thinking, you killed my fatted calf to give to my brother who doesn't deserve it. He's resenting the calf, and it's as if you're robbing me of the love and the father's care that I deserve that he doesn't. Do you remember the quote I said earlier about My Fair Lady? About I'm the undeserving poor and I need more? Well, the younger son was the undeserving poor. He didn't deserve any of this. And we don't know the end of the story. We know the parable, but at the end, the father father is trying to convince the son, and we don't know if the elder son was ever convinced that this was a good idea. You see, when Jesus ended this story, there was a decision had to be made. They had to choose one of the first or the third character, because the middle character was represented by God. God is the one who is so loving and so kind that he'll give us the stuff that we don't deserve. But you have to decide, are you going to be the younger brother who will come to God in humility and say, I don't deserve any of this, but I would like mercy? Or the elder brother that says, I have done all these things, I've never broken one of your commandments, and I deserve everything. See, you might be saying, well, none of us would represent the older brother. No, we represent the younger brother because we accepted Jesus as our Savior. We were saved by his grace. And how could we be the older brother? Well, you see, sometimes we've been the Christians for so long that story doesn't reverberate with us about the younger brother. And we think that, yes, God's mercy saved me, but I've spent years saving myself because that's my reasonable service. No, we can't do anything to save ourselves. Now, you see, the elder brother was hard at work earning his right to his inheritance. That can be us too. And if you think I'm wrong, let me turn you to this verse in Galatians. Paul is telling the Galatian believers in 4 verse 9 to 11, he's saying, but now you have come to know God, or rather to be known by God. How is it that you turn back to the weak and worthless elemental things to which you desire to be enslaved all over again? You observe days and months and seasons and years. I fear for you that perhaps I've labored over you in vain. Well, Paul is saying, you got this. You were saved. You understood that Jesus died for you and saved you. So why are you now focusing on religious symbols and dates and times instead of Jesus and him crucified? You see, our witness could be, many years ago, God reached down and saved me, and I've been saving myself ever since, because that's my reasonable service. You might be thinking, that's not right, Peter, you've got this all backwards. And it's true, but if we did a straw poll in the community and said, you've observed Christians from these churches who faithfully go, how can you be saved? What would they say? Would they say, you can go to church and follow a bunch of rules that are hard and take all the fun out of your life? Or would they say, well, those Christians, they're just like us. They're broken without a hope of being fixed, but they came to Jesus with nothing and received everything that's required to be saved. They struggle with sin just like us, but they have an advantage of somebody that's always there to help them. They're not better than us. They just have more help available to them. They freely admit that except for this help, they would be every bit as bad and as big a mess as we are, and maybe worse. And they don't hoard that advantage. They're trying to give it away all the time. It's almost as if they believe that sharing the love of God won't take anything away from them. It's almost as if they think God has an unlimited supply of love that he can give to me and you can share. They give it away and it doesn't mean that there's any less of it for us. We want anybody who comes to be reminded often that who our first love is and what is most important. To remember, because we say it again and again, that we don't earn salvation. Because as soon as we start saying things like that, we become like the older brother. Now, sharing our blessing to the undeserving poor means that it's not dollars and cents, it's in eternal rewards. Sharing does not mean that there will be less for us. But allowing someone else to have the things of Jesus will mean that they will need stuff from us like love and more chances to fail. And they will need to be picked back up and then know that we care about them. And they will be messy and things will be out of place. And they'll upset us by their mistakes and their leftover sins, because someone told this story of a Christian who became a Christian in church, and he'd always gone to church, and he was already at a number 5, going to number 10, and he'd moved from a 5 to a 7. And a person who had never been in church became a Christian, he moved from a 1 to a 3. They'd moved the same distance, but the guy at 3 was way behind. You see, when someone who's never heard the gospel becomes a Christian, they've got a lot further to travel. And so we have to be willing. You know, a lot of times they're going to get their ideas back to front. They're going to want to do crazy things that won't work just because they believe that God can do anything. They'll be wonderfully kind, and the next minute they'll be selfish and easily offended. And they'll drive you crazy. But as long as you say to them, we're all here and we're all on the same road, and God picked us up even though we smelled bad. And the only reason you might think that we're better off than you, but no, it's because God has been pouring His love on us for years, and the fact that we smell less bad is because of all that kindness God has been pouring on us. We're exactly like you. And if you allow us to share that love with you, then you can grow in Christ, and the next person that comes, you can be that person for them. Now, if we say, well, we're not going to say all that all the time because we don't need to hear it. We do. Or if we don't, we become like the older brother who starts to think that, look, I can earn my salvation. I can do all these good things and God will. We have to be reminded all the time that we're not saved by what good we do. We're saved because God loves us. And every day He continues to love us. And when we are the younger brother who has done something and we come back to Him and He's again that loving Father who wants to embrace us and have a party and kill the fatted calf because we did something yesterday, but today we've come to Him and we've said, Lord, I failed You again. And I appreciate that salvation You've made ready for me. Let's pray.